Edwin, thank you. We just finished a wonderful weekend exploring the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and the Bhagavad Gita. There are two very, very full-packed books with a lot of information and translations and commentaries. What do you want us to take from this workshop, from this weekend, 3 things that are the most important things of this experience?
Well, that there are options on the yoga path. We have the Patanjalian type of yoga, which is sounds a bit radical, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which is to completely still the mind. And I like to think of that, for me, Patanjali informs my morning practice. When I get up early, I always like to say, for me, Patanjali is what I do at 6 o'clock in the morning, and Bhagavad Gita is what I do 9 to 5. So I hope that one of the reasons that we compared the two texts was to get a sense that there are different kinds of yoga. Even though Krishna says actually, Sankhya and yoga, they end up in the same place. So there is a sort of meditative practice, which is still in the mind practice, but there's also a skill in action. The Gita defines yoga not as Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which is how Patanjali defines it, but as samatvam, yoga muchyate, equanimity, detached from the fruits of the work. If you're not attached to the fruits of the work, then you're not happy, sad, happy, sad. If you get so-called success or so-called failure, you're unmoved by that. And the Sanskrit term for that is samaha, to be equal, equanimous. And the Sanskrit samatvam. So that's how the Gita defines it in the 2nd chapter. And also karma sukaushalam, skill in action. So there's also a way of being in the world. There's a Nirodha type of yoga. There's a way of being in the world type of yoga, where we act, do all of our duties, but do it without attachment to the fruits. And there's also bhakti. There's also devotional yoga that accepts the existence of a supreme being that's beyond the little atma, the finite spark, the anksha spark of Brahman that we are. And so by comparing the texts, I hope that students will get a sense of these various options. They're not exclusive, they overlap, right? Karma yoga requires jnana yoga. You can't do karma yoga unless you have buddhi yoga, jnana yoga, unless the mind is fixed in the correct understanding of the self. So to get some sense of, because Patanjali read by himself is fairly intimidating. As people say, well, how do I do this? I am a mother, I have kids. So the Gita gives us, don't have time, and plus Nirodha is a very, it's a really quite a, expecting a lot to actually, cultivate a practice where one completely stills the mind.
In the 2 books, if there's going to be a lesson or a main message that we found this weekend, what would that be?
That we're not the body-mind. This is a common shared theme. It's a sine qua non of yoga, that this is a prerequisite. In other words, all yoga traditions share this understanding that we're not the body-mind, we're something beyond that. And in these traditions, we're Atman, which is we're pure consciousness. So, and the Bhagavad Gita then, that not only are we pure consciousness, but there is also a supreme consciousness beyond that, supreme being that's beyond us, Ishvara, which is there also in Patanjali, but underdeveloped. We don't really get a sense of who or what this Ishvara is. We know he's a Purusha Vishesha, and there's a few verses there beyond the kleshas and the karma, or omniscient. We have those verses, 24 to 26. The Gita develops that a bit more. So the main teachings then are, number 1, that we're not the body-mind, and
that's in both books.
Both books. 2, that there is a supreme being. That's also in both books, but much more. There's much more focus on that in the Gita, and that the goal of life is to seek that, and that anything else that we do, if that's not our goal in life, if our goal in life is to somehow satisfy the body and the mind, if we think we are the body-mind, if we don't recognize avidya, Patanjali gives a very nice definition of avidya, ignorance, if we ignore the existence of the consciousness that pervades us, and rather if we think we're body-mind, then everything we do will ultimately not provide satisfaction. That desires actually equal distress. And the pursuit of desire is always and inevitably and metaphysically and necessarily going to end up in a state of frustration. Patanjali says sarvam dukkam, the Buddha says sarvam dukkam. Krishna also says dukkalayam ashashvatam, that, you know, when we act in this world from a place of ignorance, it's just dukkam. It's always going to be unfulfilling. So I think that's a common theme in all the moksha traditions, and certainly in these two texts. That we are pure consciousness, and there are ways to experience that and realize that. There is also a consciousness even beyond that, but that if we neglect that or ignore that, then we will suffer. Ultimately, we will suffer. Even if we have good karma, it's ultimately, even if we have good jati ayoboga, to use Patanjalian terms, it's still going to be dukkam.
So Patanjali talks about Ishvara.
Yes.
And the Gita talks about Krishna.
Yes.
So these are the supreme beings, it's the supreme being that you're referring to.
Yes.
What about those that don't subscribe to the idea of a supreme being such as God? So this is the same God that we're talking about, or are these two different gods?
There's one Ishvara that may take many forms, but there's one Ishvara. When we use the term Ishvara, we're talking about a supreme being. So Ishvara is Brahman is more of a, Brahman is a term that means the absolute truth. Okay, so Brahman is the term in the Upanishads and Vedanta. Patanjali doesn't use it, Krishna does. And Brahman just means the absolute truth. And in some traditions that's understood as an impersonal truth, like Advaita Vedanta, that's ultimately impersonal. And other Vedanta traditions understand that Brahman is a personal supreme truth, and those and is Ishvara. So Ishvara is Brahman in most Vedanta traditions. Let's keep it simple. So Patanjali doesn't specify, he talks about Ishvara, he doesn't specify who Ishvara is, whereas Krishna in the Gita is very specific and clear and kind of, I won't say in your face because I don't mean to be disrespectful, he's very strong and forceful about saying that he is that supreme Ishvara. And all the characteristics that Patanjali associates with Ishvara, we find Krishna in the Gita saying, you know, all of those qualities are assigned to Krishna. But of course, what the Gita has that Patanjali doesn't have is in the Gita, Krishna comes out and says, well, actually, that's me.
So he has a name.
Yes, that name, a form, a personality, that nebulous category of Ishvara, that entity that is relatively undefined in Patanjali, 15, 20 words, the Gita is going to say, that's me. And then, of course, we go to the Bhagavata Purana, which is the text that I have been working with for years. And, of course, we get a much, much more robust, much fuller picture of who Krishna is and his various incarnations. And when he comes into the world, Krishna is, the incarnation of Krishna. The story of Krishna's life is the Bhagavata Purana. Gita obviously doesn't tell us anything about Krishna's incarnation, other than he happens to be the chariot driver at that moment. The Gita is actually in a much bigger text called the Mahabharata. But even the Mahabharata, we don't get much about Krishna's earlier life. We get a little bit about Krishna, the Prince of Dwarka, his adult life. The Krishna of Bhakti and devotion is the Krishna of the Bhagavad Purana, where we have really, that's the text that... So therefore, sticking to the Gita then Krishna, yes, claims to be that supreme being.
So in order to get the big picture of yoga, we need to study many different texts. But how do we know that, for example, well, I trust your translation, but how do we know? I speak different languages. How do I know that this translation is telling me properly, it has the proper translation? And because from studying with you, I've seen that sometimes some of the translators and the commentators, they take liberties with the translation of the Sanskrit. Like when you go watch a movie, and if I'm watching the movie and I speak Spanish and there's a translation in English that may not be exactly what it means. Yeah. So how do we know what we're looking at? How do we know it's a good translation, except for yours?
Well, you don't know that unless you're going to learn Sanskrit. So if you're going to learn Sanskrit, then you'll know for yourself, from your own ego, place of, from your own study. But otherwise, this and other translations, they give the word for word. Mm-hmm. So then at least you can have some sense of what the words mean.
The ones that do that, because not
The
all
ones
of
that
them
do that. Traditionally, what you do is nobody knows what the sutras, and we can't really just read the sutras and understand the sutras. So traditionally, the Yoga Sutras are always studied with the commentaries, and especially the commentary of Vyasa, the first commentary. So in traditional pre-modern India, before yoga comes to the West, Vyasa, the commentary of Vyasa is canonical, becomes part of the text almost. So you have the sutras, and the commentary is always tagged onto that. So both of them together are canonical, almost to the point where some scholars, even one very good scholar today, argues that actually Vyasa, Patanjali is Vyasa, writing his own commentary, his own text. That's how closely connected. You cannot read the sutras without the commentary. So the idea of just reading the sutras, you can't construe meaning for them. Verses like vitarka, vichara, asmita, ananda, right? These words mean different things. Even in the sutras themselves, vitarka means, asmita means something else.
So that's where it gets complete.
We are dependent on the guides, the commentators. There's no way of bypassing them. People try to do that, and good luck. And but traditionally, the traditional way of studying is to accept the interpretation of the commentators. Now, the thing about the Yoga Sutra tradition is the commentators agree with each other, more or less. With little quibbles, right, between Vijnana Bhikshu, Vachaspati, later commentators. But you have a pretty streamlined and consistent interpretation. They don't disagree on the big picture things. That there's Purusha, there's Prakriti, that there's a Chitta, that's Samadhi, da-da-da-da. So we have several centuries of commentaries. And the later ones may add a little bit more, or give some more elaboration, but they don't fundamentally disagree. The quibbles are small. That's not the case with the Gita. So the Gita, even though it's much easier to understand, you could actually read the Gita slokas, most of them without a commentary, right? Because they're much more elaborate. It's a shloka, it's not a sutra, it's condensed, tiny, right? Minimalistic. There's only an average of 6 words per sutra. The difference between the Gita is part of the Vedanta tradition. And the difference between the Vedanta tradition and the Sutra tradition is that the commentaries of the sutras all agree with each other, more or less, not the Gita, not the Vedanta Sutra and the Gita commentarial traditions.
Why is that?
But they're very, very different. In terms of, well, what is Atman? What is Brahman? Is Brahman Ishvara? Is it personal? Is it impersonal? Is the Atman one with Brahman? Is it distinct from Brahman? Is the world real? Is
so
it not?
We get different interpretations.
Then you have different schools.
It's not even translation.
You have a much larger issue to deal with. It's not just, well, this word is taking a liberty and this is not in the text. You then have to decide which school to align oneself with.
And what are the schools?
Well, the Advaita Vedanta, non-dualist school, and then the Iyengar school, which is Vishishta Dvaita Vedanta, where the soul is somewhat distinct from Brahman, one but also distinct, and Brahman is Ishvara, is Krishna Narayana. So the real serious, major differences in fundamental philosophical principles. So therefore the Gita, as part of Vedanta, presents a different set of challenges in terms of whether one is aligning oneself with non-dualistic interpretations of it, or more theistic, monotheistic interpretations. And that's very challenging for Westerners that have no background in Indian philosophy, and it's challenging to teach that in a small workshop because you don't want to start getting into all these metaphysical details. People start falling asleep. That's a challenge. In some ways, it's easier to teach the sutras because it's one theme, one yoga, chitta vritti nirodha, boom, 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 boom. It's like Patanjali keeps his eye on the ball, and he tells us right at the beginning what he's going to do. He's going to utter yoga anushasana. The Gita, first of all, has got so much going on inside it. Karma yoga, jnana yoga, dhyana yoga, the gunas, Vedic sacrifice, bhakti yoga. But then it also becomes subject to all of these various interpretations that are serious. They're not trivial. They're fundamentally, is God personal or impersonal? Is the world false or is it real? What could be a more fundamental disagreement than that? Is the Atman completely and utterly one with Brahman like water, a drop of water merging into the ocean, or is it a distinct entity eternally? These are the most fundamental differences you could possibly have in philosophical discourse. And so the GIta and the commentaries on the GIta disagree on those kinds of, not little quibbles, major metaphysical elements.
Let me ask you if I'm getting this right. So,
Yes.
Bhagavad Gita. I am not the body,
Yes.
but I have a soul.
Yes.
And there's a supreme being,
Yes.
God.
Yes.
And they're separate.
According to many.
According to Patanjali, which is what I've studied more.
Yes.
Is that
According
right?
to Patanjali, yes. I think we can make that case quite strongly.
And then Bhagavad Gita.
Then it depends on the commentaries.
So this is where it gets.
This is where it gets to, yes.
I am God.
Yeah, the Atman and that Ishvara is Brahman, and Brahman and Atman and Brahman are completely and utterly the same thing. Atman actually is Brahman, and the Advaita Vedanta tradition would say ultimately all of this is false. The world is false, creation is false, therefore creator is false. If the creation is false, then Ishvara is also ultimately false. It's maybe real and conventional in the world of illusion. Looks like there's a creation, looks like I'm here and you're there and God is up there and there's a world.
It's all an illusion.
Of Vyavaharika, but in the Paramartika that all evaporates and creation evaporates, therefore the notion of a creator evaporates and the notion of separateness evaporates, and what is left is Sarvamidam Kalu Brahman, all-pervading Brahman. That's Advaita Vedanta, non-dual, Shankar. But not the other Vedanta traditions, the Vaishnava, the theistic ones. No, the world is real, Creator is real, Brahman is Ishvara. It's not like there's Ishvara and then beyond that is Brahman. No.
To be connected or be a part of him.
You're distinct. There's a distinction. Even the ones that say that the soul is a part of Brahman, but it's still a distinct part. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if they're distinct, then what happens in liberated state? Well, a relationship of bhakti and love and devotion it continues in the liberated state. Very, very different. So these are the kinds of issues that GIta, the challenges that GIta, if you're a teacher, many teachers are embedded in a sect. If you invite an Indian Swami, they're going to give you the interpretation on these kinds of issues according to their sect. But if you're not a sectarian teacher, and you're trying to be a scholar or an objective, then what do? You can't start telling them all the differences, because then, in a yoga studio, 10-hour workshop,
you don't have time for that.
And people are just going to that's not what they came for.
And some people are not interested. They just want to do dog posts.
Yeah, but at the same time, you can't ignore these issues. They want to know what the GIta means. Well, how do you answer that question? Well, it means this for Shankara, and it means that for Ramanuja. Mm-hmm. So how do you somehow respect the integrity not only of the text but of the traditions that come from it, and at the same time not get too technical and complicated? It's fairly challenging.
So what is my sect following Guruji Iyengar?
Yours would be depends on how you're following Guruji Iyengar.
As a Catholic following Guruji Iyengar, what's my sect?
Well, most followers of Guruji Iyengar are followers of his asana teachings. Mm-hmm. But Guruji Iyengar has this other side to him, which is the Vaishnava side, which I think is going to start coming out more, because there's some research is going to come out of that now, which is going to speak more to that. It depends on you whether you subscribe to that other side of Guruji Iyengar. But those that do subscribe to that, Sri Vaishnavism, then in that tradition, the soul is one with, but also distinct from Brahman, eternally. And Brahman is ultimately Ishvara Narayana. And Narayana resides in the Vaikuntha, in the kingdom of God, which is beyond Prakriti. Everything is Narayana. Everything, it's not like there's, people call it dualistic, but he doesn't call it dualistic. So what are you? You have to decide, okay, here's Guruji Iyengar, and you're a follower of him, what that means for you. If that means the asana tradition and the teachings in his books, then that's what you follow.
Yeah, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali.
Exactly. So then that's what he gave you. Mm-hmm. That's what he shared. So why not be content with that? But now if someone, maybe a few of his followers, become interested in this whole other side of his spirituality, there's no reason why they have to do that, because he didn't share that, which means he didn't make that's not what he gave to his followers. But there's no reason also why followers cannot become interested in that, and if they do become interested in that, then they can study Sri Vaishnavism, the Vishishta Advaita tradition, which actually is very close to Christianity, because in that tradition there is God and soul and world, and they're distinct things. And the goal of Catholic, your Mexican Catholicism is Latin Christianity is that the soul is an eternal servant and devotee of God, and that, because love is service. We don't like the word servant, but actually what we should use is love, because love actually is service. That's what, when you love someone, you want to please that person, and it's reciprocal. It's not one way.
Hopefully.
So therefore, it's very similar in its metaphysical infrastructure: God, soul, world. But where the challenge comes in for a Catholic is, of course, that Sri Vaishnavism is going to say, well, that, and Catholics accept that God is a personal being, not impersonal. There's some personal dimension to God. It's not just an impersonal, all-pervading force. It may be that as well, but ultimately it's a personal, ultimate cause, source of all sources. The challenge comes when, of course, when Sri Vaishnavism is going to say, well, that's Narayana. And he has 4 arms, and he has chakra, and Shankara, and he has, that becomes very challenging, because for all sorts of reasons that we can talk about if you want to.
Well, unless you see it as, that it's all God and it's just different languages, different pictures, if you're open-minded.
That's fine.
An open-minded Catholic.
Remember, but Sri Vaishnava is not going to say these are just symbols or metaphors. They're going to say that is God. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If Guruji Iyengar had been born in a different part of India, where they have the Kali Sutras, would we be studying the Kali Sutras and not the Yogas of Patanjali?
Of course.
So this is, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are really...
Well, no, hang on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Because of where he was born, that area.
If he had still gone to Mysore and did the whole thing with asana and Krishnamacharya, and done the whole thing and come to the West, you would still be studying the Yoga Sutras. But just as he didn't share his Vaishnava side with you, he wouldn't, had he been born in Bengal and his own devotional practice had been a Kali one, he probably wouldn't have shared that with you either. That's even more scary than the Vaishnava one, in the sense of Western sensitivities. Right. So the reason he's teaching the Yoga Sutras is because that's the canonical text for asana. If you're going to teach asana, you have to, if you're an Orthodox Brahmin, as he is, you can't just invent something. You have to you have to say that which you're teaching is actually Shruti, it's grounded in the texts. So he's getting criticized by Brahmins saying, why are you so much time on the asana? Where's the authority for this? Where does it say that in our sacred text? So therefore you have to find some sacred text that says something about asana, not just some random marginal text like the Hatha Yoga Pratipika. You have a mainstream text, which means either the Vedas or the Upanishads or the Sutras or the epics. So at least the Yoga Sutras is one of the recognized 6 sutra traditions, and at least it has 3 verses on asana, but at least there's some authority. At least it's grounded. In other words, the teaching of asana at least has some anchor in the body of the body of text that is recognized by almost all Brahmins in India. So that's why the Yoga Sutra gets used.
Well, and he also kind of took the sutras and is teaching the sutras through the asana practice.
Right, that's his right as a commentator. Right. But the point is, why is he using the sutras? Why not just teach? Why not write a book?
Are there other books that are talking about asana, or just the yoga?
No, not mainstream books. There's a Hatha Yoga Pratipika, but no one really had ever heard of that till modern times. It was there, but it was a marginal text, I don't know, in the Himalayas somewhere. It would have been known to certain Shakta communities. It wasn't a mainstream text. Nobody quotes it in the history of Indian intellectual history. What do they quote? They quote the Upanishads, the Vedanta, the Sutras, the epics. No one's quoting Hatha Yoga Pratipika. It's not a mainstream text. We know that just from the fact that no one pays any attention to it or even seems to know about it. So the reason he chose the sutras is because it forms part of the main cluster of texts recognized by everyone. more or less.
Was it Krishnamacharya that started this whole big
think
boom
so,
of
yeah.
interest in the Yoga
Yeah.
Sutras of Patanjali?
Yeah, as far as I understand.
So if perhaps Krishnamacharya hadn't been teaching Patanjali, then maybe Guruji wouldn't have been also teaching Patanjali?
And he didn't need to. He could have just taught his own. He had the charisma and the power and the influence to write his own books, which he did. But because he's orthodox, there's a part of him that's an orthodox Brahmana. He didn't want to just teach some new thing, like say Rajneesh might have done, or Krishnamurti, right? Where they're giving their teaching. They're not grounding it in some authority higher than themselves. They're not grounding it in scriptural authority. They're just giving their own realizations and illuminations. But an Orthodox Brahmana doesn't do that. An Orthodox Brahmana is not just saying, I've discovered something new, this is my enlightenment, these are my realizations, which even the Buddha did. But an Orthodox Brahmana is thinking of himself as transmitting pre-existing truths. So if that's the case, then they need to find some pre-existing source for those truths. And the only pre-existing source for asana that's recognized in the larger tradition is the Yoga Sutras. At least it has asanas in it. And then you go and find the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, you might find some other, but those are not primary texts. They're not primary texts recognized by all communities in India. Whereas the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Itihasa, the two epics, the Puranas, and the Sutras, the Smriti, they are recognized by most communities, whether they're Shaivite or Vaishnava or Smarta, whatever they are.
Somebody that is an atheist, can an atheist be a yogi? Or do they have to have devotion, not necessarily to Supreme Being, but just perhaps devotion to the practice?
I mean, Jains are formidable yogis. Early Buddhists, Theravada Buddhists, formidable yogis. They were heavy-duty yogis, and they're non-theistic. So to do Chitta Vritti Nirodha practices, you don't need to be a theist.
You don't have to be.
But Patanjali is theistic. But there are other forms. Even the sutras, in the first chapter he says Ishvara Pranidhana Dva. He even gives a little bit of optionality, although he doesn't do that in chapter 2. But there are Jains and Buddhists, possibly some early Sankhya traditions, but Jains and Buddhists. And they're doing Chitta Vritti Nirodha practice, so we can call them yogis. If yoga is Chitta Vritti Nirodha, if yoga is Chitta Vritti Nirodha, then a yogi is one who does Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So therefore Jains and Buddhists, early Buddhists and Jains are yogis.
That's all they do.
Yeah, but they're not theistic.
Well, so tell us about your next book. It's going to be about Bhakti Yoga?
It is. It's going to be a sequel, and we'll see how it goes down. I suspect it's not for everybody, Bhakti, because it's going to be more challenging. But it's mostly translations from the Bhagavata Purana, which I mentioned before, which is a heavily theistic text, with an introduction about what Bhakti is, what's puja, what's kirtan, and different kinds of Bhakti. And also some of the things we touched upon, because Ishvara is understood differently in different traditions. In Advaita Vedanta, Ishvara is understood in a certain sort of way. Kashmiri Shaivism, another sort of way. So, some mention of the different ways Ishvara is understood. Even though the Bhakti practices have a lot in common, but their ultimate value differs. Because the ultimate value of Bhakti depends on the ultimate value of Ishvara. And the ultimate value of Ishvara, we just said, right? Advaita Vedanta, Ishvara has no ultimate value. So even though Advaita Vedantins do Bhakti, it's not ultimate. Whereas the Iyengar tradition, Ishvara is ultimate, and therefore Bhakti is ultimate, and therefore Bhakti is eternal. And that's what you do in the liberated state. You don't just sarupe vastanam. You're not just immersed in your own infinite, eternal nature. You're having an active personal relationship with the personal God for all eternity. And the Krishna tradition gets very, very personal about what some of those relationships look like. In terms of Krishna, having Krishna as your child, having Krishna as your lover, having Krishna as your friend, the different rasas, the different bhavas. We're entering into a new spiritual universe when we look at. So I'm trying to touch on some of that.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
So do I.
Thank you.
If our goal in life is to somehow satisfy the body and the mind, if we think we are the body-mind, if we don't recognize avidya, Patanjali give a very nice definition of avidya, ignorance, if we ignore the existence of the consciousness that pervades us, and rather if we think we're body-mind, then everything we do will ultimately not provide satisfaction. That desires actually equal distress. And the pursuit of desire is always and inevitably and metaphysically and necessarily going to end up in a state of frustration. Patanjali says sarvam dukkam, the Buddha says sarvam dukkam. Krishna also says dukkalayam ashashvatam, that, you know, when we act in this world from a place of ignorance, it's just dukkam. It's always going to be unfulfilling. So I think that's a common theme in all the moksha traditions, and certainly in these two texts. That we are pure consciousness, and there are ways to experience that and realize that. There is also a consciousness even beyond that, but that if we neglect that or ignore that, then we will suffer.